Good evening.
Good evening.
I'd like to welcome you to the Archives and History Library for another installment of our lecture series. We have a very special guest this evening, and I'll introduce him in just a moment. I do want to note two upcoming lectures. Actually, as things are heating up outside, our lecture series is heating up as well. Benjamin Woodward and Pat McClure will be here next Thursday. So actually for the next 2 Thursdays we have events. They will be doing a program on World War I, honoring and remembering soldiers who gave all in the Great War. And then a week later, on May 31st, we'll kick off our block lecture series with Anna Evans Gilmer, who will present African American life and personal perspective. So we look forward to another great year of speakers as part of that. Tonight we have as I said, a very special guest, Jack Canfield, who is a familiar person to me. He actually served as press spokesman for Governors Hulett C, J. Rockefeller, and Bob Wise. He was also a member of the House of Delegates. He served as Commissioner of Employment Security, was Vice President of CAMC, and a Public Relations and Advertising Executive in Charleston until he retired in 2015. He is a member of the West Virginia Broadcasting Hall of Fame. He's a native of Mineral County and attended Potomac State and WVU. He's contributed to the Encyclopedia, and he's also served as a volunteer here at the Archives, doing work on various governor's papers. He brought in a couple of things. He's also a donor. I would say a couple of personal notes. He introduced me to Governor Hulett C. We went down to the governor's house and took out a lot of photographs and different things, but it was a real honor to get to meet Governor Smith. And I also was roommate and bandmate to Jack's son, Chris Canfield, who is now a very prominent tourism official in Virginia. But tonight he's going to talk about a fascinating topic, 1968. That certainly was prominent in our nation and in our state, and I look forward to tonight's talk. Please help me in welcoming Jack Canfield.
Joe says he was a bandmate of our son Chris. The only band that I knew Chris played in, he played guitar, and he came home with a pink ponytail. Were you in that one, Joe?
I think so.
Joe called and he said, you know, I read where you were in journalism school, they gave you an award for advocating free speech. And he said, do you still believe in free speech? And I said, yes, I do. And he said, good, I want you to come and make one at Science and Culture in May. Don Miller, his editorial page editor of the Charleston Gazette, am I not on?
Sure, you're fine, but
okay. I was here tonight. Don and I have had the experience of teaching at the University of Charleston, just guests, maybe one class a week. And we enjoyed that tremendously. And when I teach, I have Don come in and team up with Gary Chernenko, who worked for the hospital, and Don worked for the newspaper, to tell you what happens when they go against each other or work together. And you'll appreciate this story, but I was thinking, you gotta love West Virginia, because I have no voice tonight. I've been out with this. I had a black car yesterday. It's green today. I've been down with this for a week. My wife got hit with it yesterday. So I'll try. I hope you can hear this. But West Virginia is just absolutely beautiful. I don't know where else you can go and walk your dog on a Sunday morning. My dog's name is Heidi, and I have her trained so that if a car's coming, I say, Heidi, and she stops. And I was walking down toward Canal River, just beautiful in the springtime, and heard a car coming. I said, Heidi. This guy sitting in his porch says, Heidi, how are you? So when we were at University of Charleston, my first night, I went early to get set up. I still use overheads. They just laugh at me. And I went in to get a cup of coffee in the student union where they have a Starbucks, and there were these obvious football players right in front of me. And this one guy turns to the other and he said, what do you have next? He said, oh, I think I got some accounting course. Let me look. He said, oh, no, it's Introduction to Public Relations. Canfield. Shit. "What kind of name is that?" I tapped him on the shoulder. I said, "Hi, I'm Mr. Canfield. I'll see you about 20 minutes over there. What's your name?" He said, "Ahmed Abdul Shakar." I said, "What kind of name is that?" He came in. He was a good student. He was the last person to get there for class, though, and he kind of went to the back of the room. My first week in government, I went to work on Tuesday for the House of Representatives, and Jack Kennedy was assassinated on Friday. So that was my introduction. So I was in Washington when Lyndon Johnson said, "All I have I would give not to be standing here tonight." And I got to sit in the galleries and watch Hubert Humphrey do battle with Bob Byrd over civil rights. But we missed Charleston. So we came back, and I got a job with Governor Smith in his campaign, just as an advance man, but his speechwriter quit about 2 weeks before the election. And I had this book of Jack Kennedy speeches that I had brought back from Washington. So for 2 weeks, Hulett Smith sounded just like Jack Kennedy. And we won that election. But I want to talk about 1968. And bear with me, I think I can get through this. I said I'd talk 1968. I'm going to back up about 2.5 weeks to December the 15th, 1967. This is from the book, The Papers and Public Addresses of Governor Hulett Smith, which lets everything he said speak for itself. I don't do any editorializing in it. Any comments about his administration came from Bob Mellis of the Charleston Daily Mail, John Morgan of the Charleston Gazette. In Point Pleasant, West Virginia, on December 15th, the 5 o'clock rush hour traffic had already begun across the Silver Bridge, linking the Mason County community with the Kanawha and Gallipolis, Ohio. The suspension bridge, there were only 3 of its kind in the free world, was swift. The Ohio River was swift beneath it. A little more than an hour's drive away in Charleston, Governor Smith across the street was near the end of a busy day meeting with, if you can believe this, people from Mingo County who were complaining about their roads. And he was in what's now in the Secretary of State's office, which was then called the Governor's Conference Room. I was in my office right across the sidewalk here with Katie Thomas, who was my secretary at the time. Jean Giannakis, who was on the governor's staff in the long hallway, heard the phone ring and picked it up. And she said that Trooper White, who was on the governor's security detail, had just talked with Colonel Welty, the superintendent of public safety, and he just learned that the Silver Bridge had collapsed and that it was real bad. He wanted to speak with Paul Crabtree, who was the governor's administrative assistant, who was from Point Pleasant. And Crabtree said, "Oh, he can't be talking about the Silver Bridge. Surely he's talking about the little bridge over the Kanawha." And Whitey said, "No, he says it's the Silver Bridge." And Paul said, "How extensive is it?" And he said, "I don't know, but they said it was terrible." So Crabtree ran into the governor's conference room, broke the meeting up. By this time I had the report. And so we tried to call Point Pleasant. We didn't have beepers. We didn't have cell phones. We didn't have fax machines. We didn't have computers. I had a phone on my desk with 4 lines, and when you wanted to call elsewhere in West Virginia, you went through what was called a tie line. And it'd be like 251 was a tie line to Huntington, and 153 was Point Pleasant. I forget what it was. So we called tried Point Pleasant. Couldn't get through. Tried Huntington. We thought we could get through that way. Couldn't get through. All the circuits were jammed. We tried direct dialing. We couldn't get through. All the circuits were jammed. We tried going through the operator, and that failed too. It was now 5:45. Now this is December, so it was dark already. And the governor had gone back to his office along with the road commissioner, the finance and administration commissioner who was in charge of the emergency disaster plan, state police superintendent. And as he was getting ready to get in the car and head for Point Pleasant, we got a call finally from Lieutenant Flowers, who was head of the governor's security detail, who also lived in Point Pleasant, but happened to be there that evening with his family. And so he talked to Crabtree because they both knew the same town. And he said, "Paul, the bridge has completely disappeared. It was full of cars." Well, Crabtree had 5 children, and his wife Rita commuted at 5 o'clock in the evening from across that bridge. So Flowers was there. He had family there. So they all were deeply concerned, of course, and then concerned about the magnitude of the situation. When they arrived, they said the silence was something that they would never forget. And it was some days later before the final count was determined. There was 46 dead, 35 vehicles had collapsed under the bridge, and the bridge itself was a total loss. As one witness said, one minute it was there, and the next minute it was gone. So I'm 20-some years old. I'm sitting in the governor's press office. Crabtree is on his way to Point Pleasant. The governor's on his way to Point Pleasant. Everybody's up there, and the phone starts ringing. The BBC calls from London. What happened? Who's to blame? How old was the bridge? When was it built? How many cars a day go over it? 1,750 feet long. How are you going to get people across the river? We're going to start a shuttle service. Are you going to close any identical bridges? Yes, there are only 3 in the world. And this is when you got to get on the phone and get all your department people in and be ready to answer Dawn when she calls with this. And the good thing was we did have an emergency plan in place, and we were able to implement it just like that. The ultimate cause was a tiny, tiny crack in one of the weight-bearing eye bars. And they had an interesting documentary on this recently because it was the 50th anniversary. And it turns out that after all these years they have concluded, I mean, there was a lot of controversy about the inspections and all of that, and there were a lot of laws passed afterwards about inspection of bridges. But they concluded that that tiny hairline crack in that one weight-bearing eye bar was there when it came away from the manufacturer and had been there all those years. But what happened was when the bridge was built, it was the 1920s. And the cars that came across were not that heavy, nor were the trucks. Now you're in 1967, and the weight load was much heavier. So Governor Smith, going into his lame duck year, they said, oh, he doesn't have to deal with anything, he doesn't make decisions. Here's what happened. So you get December 67, and you have the Silver Bridge. Then we go to January of 68. The Vietnam War in January of 68 was at its worst peak. When that war started, 8 out of 10 people supported it. It was a domino theory. We had treaties with them. We needed to be there. By January of 68, only 4 out of 10 favored our involvement in Vietnam. Johnson was president. Senator Kennedy, Senator McCarthy were bolting the party line. And public sentiment did not turn south until the war had been going on, and it was the first television war. You got to remember at that time, every time the planes came in with coffins from overseas, it was on the evening news. Now, Iraq, they don't allow that anymore at the air bases, but they did then. People, today's generation, they know Iraq and they know Afghanistan. How many West Virginians died in Iraq and Afghanistan? This was the last figure I saw. And this was in the fall when I did this at WVU. 39. How many West Virginians died in Vietnam? Yeah. $1,182. My brother was over there twice, flying helicopters, in intelligence, a paratrooper, and drawing fire from the Viet Cong as he went in to rescue people. Thank God he made it back with all kinds of awards. He still didn't talk about it. Trying to get him to write a book, and he just laughs at me. We were at Hilton Head the night they invaded Iraq, and we'd ordered a pizza. And I'll never forget, the guy from Giuseppe's came in and he said, heck, we'll be out of there in 6 weeks at the most. And that was in 1990, what, first year we went over there? So I was a loyal employee, and I was writing speeches for Governor Smith, who was very close to Lyndon Johnson. And so I was having to write pro-Vietnam policy speeches. But my heart was with Bobby Kennedy, even though I didn't like him as a man. His message just resonated with me. I did have the pleasure of meeting President Kennedy, or I'm sorry, I did, but I had the pleasure of meeting President Johnson. Surprisingly handsome, imposing man in person. It's like Lady Bird. The cameras never loved Lady Bird. She was here in '67 at sunrise, and I was able to host her. You were the photographer there, Jerry. And most petite, beautiful, nice little lady you've ever seen in your life. So I go to St. Louis. Now you got to realize I'm not a policymaker. I'm the kid who carries the governor's briefcase, and I still had a hat in those days. Granddaddy said you always wore a hat and tipped your hat to the lady. So I go to St. Louis, and I call my mother up in Kaiser. And I said, Mother, you're not going to believe this, but I'm going to meet the President of the United States. Because the governor is allowed to take one staffer in this meeting with him. It's just the Democratic governors and the president. And he's asked me to come with him. So I'll let you know what happened. So I thought, oh, here I am, this idealistic West Virginia University graduate who's, just seeing the President of the United States. And Johnson walks in the room, towering, handsome man, very complicated. But he just leans down and he says, I don't mind them Republicans criticizing my Vietnam policy, but I'll be goddamned if I have the Democratic governors doing it. So I called him and said, Mother, my image of the presidency has changed somewhat. I was used to Jack Kennedy's speeches, not LBJ's Texan style. So that Vietnam's peaking in January. So you come to February of '68. Now this is Governor Smith's last year. By the way, during the campaign, I did want to mention one thing. They're talking about attitudes and the way people behave in politics today. In '64, when I ended up being the speechwriter 2 weeks before the election, we were campaigning, and my best friend in college was Bill Phillips, president of the Young Republicans. We were both Potomac State together, very close to Cecil Underwood. Cecil and Hulett were running for governorship at the same time. So the four of us would often end up in the same towns. So they'd go after each other all day long on their policies, not on their personalities, not against them personally, but on their policies. And then we'd have a break for dinner, and we'd all end up at a cafe somewhere off to the side. And Hulett and Cecil would have dinner, and Bill and I would have dinner, and then we'd go back to work the next day. That's how civil we were in those days. And Hulett and Cecil, even though they had been political opponents, both vying for the same office, were friends until their deaths, very close friends. But I'm sitting in the press office on Valentine's Day in February of '68. Paul Crabtree, the governor's chief of staff, is on vacation at St. Abel Island, which has one phone. It's a pay phone at the grocery store. And I get this phone call. Oh, they have no fax, they have no cell phone, they have no internet, they have no texting. So I get this call that the grand jury has just indicted our former governor on conspiracy for bribery charges, Governor Barron, plus his business associate and lawyer, plus a Clarksburg car dealer, plus 3 of our administration's department heads who had worked in the Barron administration, indicted for activities that allegedly happened during the Barron administration. So Governor Smith, the man who'd made no decisions, had to fire all of them. And I've always wanted to point out, and people ignore this because the press at the time tended to talk about the Barron-Smith administration, which really ticked me off, but the federal prosecutor actually issued a statement, and it's in the book that Joe has back there, which is the big, thick book that I edited, which is called The Papers and Public Addresses of Governor Hulett C. Smith, which the Gazette said was only 27 pages shorter than Gone with the Wind. But it did a good job with it. But the federal prosecutor actually said and issued a statement that not one of the indictments related to anything that happened in the Smith administration. They were all for incidents in the previous administration, and he issued a public statement to that effect. Hulett Smith was a gentleman, and he was a gentleman. Well, the president is losing support. Our party's in disarray. The former governor has just been indicted. The Attorney General, Don Robertson, the chairman of the Democratic Party, Jim Sprouse, Senator Paul Kaufman from here in Charleston, all want to run for governor, as does a guy, congressman in Washington we don't see very often by the name of Arch Alfred Moore Jr. So comes March, after going through that, and it's a Sunday evening in March the 31st, and I get this call from Governor Smith. He said, Jack, and this is not generally known, but it's the truth. Hulett, a few of the other governors and some of the senators, and Vice President Humphrey had quietly been trying to persuade President Johnson to get to the bargaining table, to stop the bombing and get to the bargaining table. The president resisted and refused. He is the president. But they had been working it out, and Hulett called me at home that night and he said, President's making a speech to the country. They say it's going to be a major speech. I think we may be getting to the bargaining table. Be sure to listen. So we listened, and the words we heard were, I shall not seek, nor will I accept the nomination of my party for another term as your president. So now we have a gubernatorial campaign coming up, and we have the President of the United States, and everything was in place for him to get reelected. So what's Governor Smith do? Well, of course, he's close personal friends. He and Mrs. Smith are close personal friends with Vice President Muriel Humphrey, and they were very close friends. So that puts him against the people in West Virginia who were for Senator Kennedy and Senator McCarthy. The president had lost the confidence of the country. I mean, that's happened when Walter Cronkite said that we shouldn't be in Vietnam. And when he said, Johnson said, when we lost Cronkite, I've lost the country. This is a fascinating book. It's called The 31st of March, and it's written by Horace Bundy. And it's all about Johnson's final days in office, but his speech on March 31st. And Bundy was closest to him. And he was the only one who knew what was in the speech. Even Mrs. Johnson didn't know. And Johnson kept it in his coat pocket, and nobody knew until he uttered the words whether he would do it or not. And he didn't know until the last minute. Well, that was March the 31st. Then 4 days later, Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated. And the country erupted. Bobby Kennedy was in Indianapolis that night, and the people there didn't know it. They didn't know that King had been assassinated, and they were turning out for a rally, and he didn't know about it till he was at the bottom of the stage, and they told him about it, and he went up to the microphone. Without a note, he said, ladies and gentlemen, I'm only going to talk to you for just a minute or so this evening because I have some very sad news for all of you, and I think sad news for all of our fellow citizens and for people who love peace all over the world, and that is that Martin Luther King was shot and killed tonight in Memphis, Tennessee. In this difficult day, in this difficult time for the United States, it's perhaps well to ask what kind of a nation we are and what direction we want to move in. For those of you who are black, considering the evidence is there that white people were responsible, you can be filled with bitterness and with hatred and a desire for revenge against all white people. I would only say that I can also feel in my heart the same kind of feeling. I had a member of my family killed, and he was killed by a white man. What we need in the United States is not division. What we need in the United States is not hatred. What we need in the United States is not violence and lawlessness, but love and wisdom and compassion and a feeling of justice toward those who still suffer. I ask you to return home. Say a prayer for the family of Martin Luther King Jr. That night, all over America, cities were burned down, the country erupted, except in Indianapolis, Indiana. There were no riots, there were no burnings in Indianapolis. A lot of people don't realize, but we had problems in West Virginia too. There was a lot of racial prejudice going on in West Virginia in 1968. There were fights over Bluefield State College between those who were looking for certain civil rights and those who were opposed to it. Should they merge the colleges? Should they not? The State Human Rights Commission had been conducting investigations into racial tensions that led to several students being suspended, and the gymnasium at the college was bombed, and the dormitories were closed. So that was Bluefield State. In June, we needed to rest, so we headed to Hilton Head, or I guess Virginia Beach in those days. I was physically and emotionally exhausted. I mean, it was in my 20s. I hadn't dealt with stuff like this before. And I turned on the TV to watch the primary election results from California, and I fell asleep sometime during the night on the couch. And I woke up sometime in the middle of the night and heard them say that Senator Kennedy had been taken to the hospital after having been shot in California. The next day he died, and he was shot from a gun brought from a mail order catalog. Jack Kennedy was shot from a gun bought from a mail order catalog. Everyone had written off Governor Smith as a lame duck, but I want you to imagine any other governor doing what he did. This is forgotten. After the King and Kennedy assassinations, the next day, he told the press, "We have to take steps to become a civilized nation," and he proposed gun control for West Virginia and the nation. He said he would require registration and licensing of firearms dealers, registration of all firearms in the state, the requirement that a certificate of approval from a government agency be given before firearms could be purchased, and a cooling off period. He said, "This must be done. We absolutely have to control the sale and use of firearms and prohibit mail order murder in the United States." Now, I'm not arguing your position on gun control or not. I'm just making the public policy statement that that was a brave thing to do in 1968. And I can't think of any governor today who would do the same thing. The governor who wouldn't make decisions. Chilton once said to Governor Smith, once said of Governor Smith, you know, he was your vassalency, or whatever the word is. He didn't make decisions. And Governor Smith turned to me and he said, "You know, Jack, sometimes not making a decision is making the best decision." He never let it get to him. He never let it get to him. July, okay, let's see up here. June, July, Union Carbide goes on strike. Yeah, that was the largest employer in the valley at the time, I think. It was a national labor stoppage, but against power generating facilities. And so they called the state police out. But the state police are limited by law in what they can do. Everybody thinks that, though, they can take the side of the strikers or they can take the side of the plant. You can't do that. They are prohibited by law from taking a side. The only thing they can do is make sure that public order is kept. It was a very tense time. I'll skip my speech on gun control. Comes August, I was elected a delegate to the Democratic National Convention as a supporter of Hubert Humphrey. Governor Smith was chairman of the delegation, and I was secretary because I wrote good, took notes. So June and I dropped the kids off at Kaiser, and we got on the train in Cumberland, Maryland, and we went all the way to Chicago, thinking it was going to be a wonderful, nice convention in Chicago. How wonderful. We were going to nominate Hubert and be happy and go home. It was the only time in my life I ever rode on a bus that had armed men with machine guns on the bus with us as we drove from the hotel. I forget the hotel. We were at the Palmer House. Humphrey was at the Hilton. We went from the hotel to the Cow Palace for the convention. And when we were at the Hilton for an event for the vice president, they threw stink bombs and tear gas in the lobby. So that's how June and I were introduced to Chicago on our first trip west. That's the furthest we'd ever been from Kaiser, West Virginia, I think. Just in front of us, 2 rows in front of us, was Mayor Daley. And I know you saw the video of him standing up telling Senator Ribicoff what to do at the end of his speech. If you read lips, you know what he said. Vice President Humphrey came out of that Chicago a wounded, hobbled candidate for president. He was 20 points behind Richard Nixon. 20 points. I've always felt, and most Humphrey supporters felt, that had Senator McCarthy endorsed Hubert Humphrey sooner than he did, it would have made the difference in the election. The reason I say the difference in the election is that Humphrey went from 20 points behind to losing the election by 0.5%. He came that close, that close. He had no money, he had to take loans, he had to sell his home, he had to do everything. And then in West Virginia, so it was Humphrey and Muskie against Nixon and Agnew, and Governor George Wallace got in it. So if you take away Wallace's votes, which were from traditionally West Virginia, the Democratic South, the Nixon Southern strategy hadn't been kicked into place yet. Humphrey could have won the campaign, in my opinion. Comes October, 3 days before the election, Archmore's helicopter crashes. Now, Jim Sprouse said he knew the minute that happened that he was done. Because cameras were there, of course, and Arch came out saying, "God has saved me to be governor of West Virginia." that was his story, and he stuck to it. Whether God had anything to do with it, I don't know, but his helicopter crash put him over the top. That's my story, and I'm sticking to it. Humphrey lost to Richard Nixon 0.5% in November. The figures are Nixon was 31,785,000, and Humphrey was 31,275,000. And Wallace was 9 million. Governor Moore's elected. And we worked on the transition between the two administrations. Oh, I forgot to tell you, at the end of August, after we got back from the Democratic National Convention, the commercial Piedmont airline crashed up here at Yeager, killing 35 people. So we end the year up here. We've been through the election, and now it's December, and we're getting ready for the new inauguration. And there is the Mannington mine disaster. 78 miners lost their lives. It was Farmington number 9 of Consolidation Coal Company. There was this endless chain of explosions. It became commonly known as the Mannington mine disaster because of the proximity of the two communities. The rescue efforts were in vain because of the heavy, thick smoke and the high carbon monoxide content in the air, and the bodies of the miners have never been recovered. I enjoyed working for Governor Smith. He and Mary Alice were wonderful people. Mary Alice suffered a stroke in the 1980s when I was working at Charleston Area Medical Center. And I used to go over and visit her and just sit in her room and hold her hand and talk to her. She died sometime later. Governor Smith, late in life, remarried. He married Nancy Pat Lewis, you know, Lewis Chevrolet in Beckley. It's now Lewis Nissan. I just thought I'd tell you, Jay. And they were together until the end. Governor Smith died at age 93. He had stayed in Beckley until the very end, and Joe and I went down twice and talked to him, and we'd walk in and he'd say, "You boys just do whatever you want to do, it's all up in the attic, go get it and go through it." He said, I don't remember all that stuff. Jack, you tell him, I don't remember that stuff. My memory's gone. You boys go ahead, you know what to do, you know what to do. I don't know what that was. So Joe and I are up in the attic, and I see this picture of Hulett with Dwight Eisenhower. I said, gosh, I have all your pictures. I've written your book. I don't remember you ever talking about being with Dwight Eisenhower. He said, oh yeah, that was 1949 in Washington at the Hilton Hotel. I was the national vice president of the JCs, and he came over to reception in the such and such room. So, bingo, there you go. Right a few months before he died, Carolyn took him to Arizona where there was family, and he was in a nice home facility out there, had his own room, and every morning he'd come down in his shirt and tie and blazer. He was, 1 year, along with Cary Grant, one of America's 10 best dressed men. He really was. So he would come down and have breakfast and lunch with everybody, and they would all call him governor, and then he passed away. And I got to participate in his funeral down in Beckley when he's now buried down at Beckley at the mausoleum side by side with Mary Alice and their son. So that's what happened in 1968. Thank you. If you have any questions, I'll take them. Otherwise, we'll just talk informally. Let's talk informally.
I'm just sort of curious. You mentioned right towards the tail end about the transition with the Moore administration in late '68, early '69, obviously. But you did at other times as well. Tell us a little bit about that transition compared to other transitions that you had at other times.
You've been around a while, haven't you? The question is about the transition between administrations. In 1968, after Congressman Moore was elected governor, Governor Smith called him. They met together in Washington. He pledged the entire support of his administration to work with his team. And on his team were Bill Loy and Norm Yost, who became, key people in his administration. I don't know whether Tom Tinder was or not at that point. And on our team, I was there for press, Paul Crabtree, the department heads. Governor Smith had instructed all of them, you're to work with them on the transition team. And it went smoothly. It was great. And then the governor called me in and said, Jack, I really appreciate the job you've done, and thanks for your help on the transition. Norm's going to be the press secretary. I said, I understand, Governor. I've lived my life in 4-year cycles. I understand. So I went to work as a reporter covering him. Sometimes he liked my reporting, sometimes he didn't. One night he called and said, Jack, can you be at the office in the morning? I said, yes, Governor. I was doing the 11 o'clock news on Channel 3. And I said, the administration, this happened today, and the governor's press secretary said. I knew you all Norm. We'd worked together on the transition. He was a nice guy. And he called, gave me a statement. I went with it. Next morning he called me in, and Norm was there, and he looked at me and he said, Norm, who speaks for this administration? And Norm said, you do, Governor. The governor looked at me and he said, Jack, the next time you have a question before the 11 o'clock news, even if it's late at night, you call the mansion and you ask for me. I said, yes, sir. And after that, whenever I had a question, I called the mansion, and he took the call every time. But during that period, I was in the legislature, and I made a few statements where I disagreed with the governor on a few things. I said things like he was spending money like a drunken sailor, and he said things about me like I was a $100 a day political hack, just little stuff like that. Well, we liked each other. I loved his wife. Shelley was a delightful woman. But then Jay wins, and I was on Governor-elect Rockefeller's transition team. Couldn't talk to anybody. No department head in state government would talk to us. What Governor Moore didn't know at the time was they did talk to us. They would call us at night and say, you guys are coming into this department, it's got this many employees, here are your major problems, you really need to be on top of them. So we did have people who were in the administration who didn't quite go with that directive, but they didn't do anything illegal. They just said, here's what you ought to know coming in. So that was the second transition. Later, he told Charlie Ryan, who has a fascinating new book out called Alacrity. It just came out. Joe's got a copy, I think. And it covers every governor from, it's amazing. But he later was quoted as telling Charlie that that was the biggest mistake he ever made, and he would never make it again because it made him look so bad and it was out of character for him. And then I think between him and Caperton, it happened all over again. So I don't know, I wasn't around.
So it really wasn't out of character.
No, it wasn't out of character. He was something else to cover. You know, the interesting thing is, Hulett was a gentleman and took his time and understood. He was a Wharton School economics graduate too, and he was, pilot and Navy pilot. And he believed in civility. Great man. Arch was detail-oriented. Hulett liked to delegate to people. Arch was detail-oriented and controlled everything. When Arch wanted to relax, he would go to Broadway shows. Jay came in. When Jay wanted to relax, he would go downstairs and play the piano. He's a great classical pianist, by the way. He can play Bach. He can play anything. And he would be stressed out that way. But it's been interesting. They are all different in different ways. Arch was a great speaker. He never said much. I mean, if you transcribe some of his speeches, they were hilarious. You know, we are here today in ourselves to celebrate a wonderful event for all of West Virginia and the nation, and on and on and on and on. Jay had a tough administration, which had the highest unemployment in the country when he was governor. So you couldn't do much. I mean, he was left to dedicate ambulances and school bleachers. I mean, we couldn't do much. But he was a great, honest man to work for. I shouldn't tell this. I think he's going to put it on YouTube. There was a delegate from southern West Virginia with whom I had served in the House. By this time, I'd left the House and was on the governor's staff, and he called me late at night and he said, "Jack, I just got a DUI. And I'm telling you, unless you call Hal Mooney, Superintendent of Police, and get that DUI dropped, there's not a bill that Jay Rockefeller has in this House that's going to come out." I said, "Can't do it." So the next morning, Jay's walking over from the mansion, and I'm standing at the mansion door. I said, "Governor, I did something last night. I just got to tell you about it." And he just chuckled, and he said, "Jack, isn't it nice to know you work for an administration where you don't have to ask first?" That's what it was like working for him. Anything else? Thank you all very much. Thanks.